The miracle of La Castellane. How a football changed everything. In the concrete maze of Marseille's most notorious neighborhood, where hope died young and dreams were a luxury few could afford, a 5-year-old boy clutched a worn leather football like it was his lifeline. Little did anyone know, it would become exactly that, not just for him, but for an entire generation who would learn that miracles don't always come from heaven. Sometimes, they come from the streets. This is the untold story of how Zinedine Zidane transformed from a forgotten kid in France's toughest projects to the most elegant footballer the world has ever seen. But more than that, it's the story of La Castellane itself, a place that was supposed to break him, but instead forged a legend. La Castellane in the 1970s wasn't just poor, it was invisible. Tucked away in the northern districts of Marseille, it was one of those places French politicians preferred to forget existed. 15 towering concrete blocks, each one identical to the next, housing 8,000 people in a space designed for half that number. The unemployment rate hovered around 40%. Drug dealing happened in broad daylight. Police sirens were the neighborhood's constant soundtrack. This was France's version of the projects, a place where the government had dumped its unwanted. Immigrants from North Africa, families fleeing poverty, people who had nowhere else to go. For most of the world, La Castellane was a cautionary tale. For the Zidane family, it was home. Ismail Zidane had arrived in Marseille in 1953 with nothing but calloused hands and unbreakable determination. He'd left his village in the Kabylie Mountains of Algeria, not for adventure, but for survival. France was booming after the war, desperate for workers to rebuild the nation. For young Algerian men like Ismail, it represented the only chance to escape poverty. But the France that welcomed his labor didn't necessarily welcome him. Ismail found work in the warehouses by the old port, loading and unloading ships during brutal night shifts that started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The pay was minimal, the conditions harsh, but it was honest work. He married Malika, a quiet woman from his home village who had followed him to Marseille. Together, they rented a tiny 3-room apartment on the 5th floor of Block H in La Castellane. No elevator, no heating, no hope of anything better. But they had something money couldn't buy, an unshakable belief that their children would have opportunities they never had. "We didn't come here for ourselves," Malika would later say. "We came for the children who weren't even born yet." On June 23, 1972, their 5th child was born. They named him Zinedine, a name that honored their Berber heritage while sounding French enough to help him fit in. From his first breath, baby Zizou was different. While his siblings cried and fussed, he watched everything with curious, intelligent eyes. But it was at age 5 that the miracle began. Ismail had managed to scrape together enough money to buy his youngest son a football. Not a proper leather ball, those cost more than a week's wages, but a cheap plastic one from the local market. He placed it in little Zinedine's hands and watched something magical happen. The boy's eyes lit up. His tiny fingers traced the ball's surface like he was reading Braille. And when he dropped it to the ground, something extraordinary occurred. The ball seemed to stick to his feet as if magnetized. There were no grass fields in La Castellane, no proper pitches, no goalposts, no white lines marking boundaries. There was only concrete, endless expanses of it, broken occasionally by walls that served as goals and painted lines that had faded years ago. But for young Zidane, those concrete courtyards became his cathedral. Every morning he would wake up at dawn and head downstairs with his ball. By the time other kids were having breakfast, he was already juggling, practicing his touch against the wall, learning to make the ball dance to his rhythm. The concrete was unforgiving. One bad touch and the ball would bounce unpredictably. But this harsh teacher gave him something grass never could: perfect control. Other kids played on perfect pitches with perfect equipment, remembered his childhood friend Jamel Belmadi. Zinedine learned on concrete with a plastic ball. When he finally played on grass, it felt like cheating. Every great player has a moment when someone believes in them first. For Zidane, that person was Jean Varad, a youth coach who ran training sessions in La Castellane's courtyards. Varad wasn't paid by any club. He was a postal worker who spent his evenings trying to keep neighborhood kids off the streets. The first time he saw 8-year-old Zidane play, Varad knew he was witnessing something special. He was tiny, skinny, quiet, Varad recalled years later. But when he had the ball, everything changed. He moved differently. The ball moved differently. It was like watching Mozart compose music. Varad became Zidane's first coach, his mentor, his protector. He taught him not just football skills, but something more important: discipline. In a neighborhood where many young men took shortcuts, Varad insisted that Zidane do things the right way. Talent is common, he told the boy. What's rare is the willingness to work harder than your talent requires. Football in La Castellane operated by different rules than in suburban clubs. Games were rougher, more physical, more desperate. Kids played like their lives depended on it because, in a way, they did. Football was their only way out. Zidane learned to protect the ball with his body, to anticipate challenges before they came, to think 3 moves ahead. When bigger, stronger kids tried to intimidate him, he learned to use their aggression against them. He developed the close control that would later make him untouchable at the highest level. But most importantly, he learned to stay calm under pressure. In La Castellane's courtyards, losing your cool meant losing the ball, and losing the ball meant losing respect. Zidane never lost either. At age 14, Zidane caught the attention of AS Cannes scouts during a youth tournament. It was his first time playing on real grass. His first time wearing proper boots. His first time being watched by professional coaches. He was terrified and brilliant in equal measure. The other kids had better equipment, better coaching, more experience, remembered the Cannes scout who discovered him. But this kid from La Castellane had something they didn't. Hunger. You could see it in every touch, every pass, every decision. The offer came 2 weeks later, a place in Cannes Youth Academy. For most 14-year-olds, it would be a dream come true. For Zidane, it was terrifying. Leaving La Castellane meant leaving everything he'd ever known: his family, his friends, his identity. But Smail and Malika made the decision easy. This is why we came to France, his father told him. So you could have chances we never had. The day Zidane left for Cannes, the entire neighborhood came out to see him off. Kids who had played with him in the courtyards, adults who had watched him grow up, elderly men who had seen too many young talents disappear into drugs or crime. As he walked toward the car that would take him to his new life, Zidane turned back one last time to look at the concrete towers that had shaped him. Years later, he would say that moment taught him everything he needed to know about loyalty and roots. You can leave the neighborhood, he whispered to himself, but the neighborhood never leaves you. Life at the Cannes Academy was culture shock. His new teammates came from comfortable middle-class families, spoke perfect French, understood references he'd never heard. They had been playing organized football since they were 6. Zidane had learned on concrete at 5. But what they had in polish, he had in substance. What they had in technique, he had in instinct. What they had in confidence, he had in determination. His coaches quickly realized they weren't just dealing with a talented teenager. They were dealing with someone who had been forged in fire. The same streets that were supposed to limit him had actually liberated him. While other players were afraid to take risks, afraid to fail, Zidane played with the fearlessness of someone who had already survived the worst. By age 16, Zidane was dominating youth competitions. His close control, developed on unforgiving concrete, made him untouchable on grass. His vision, sharpened by years of finding space in cramped courtyards, allowed him to see passes others couldn't imagine. But the real transformation wasn't physical, it was mental. The quiet kid from La Castellane was becoming a leader. His teammates began looking to him not just for skill, but for guidance. He carried himself differently, spoke with authority, commanded respect without demanding it. He had the confidence of someone who had already conquered the hardest challenge. After La Castellane, everything else was easy. On May 20th, 1989, 17-year-old Zinedine Zidane made his professional debut for AS Cannes. It was a nothing game against Nantes, late in the season, with nothing at stake. But for everyone watching in La Castellane gathered around the few televisions in the neighborhood, it was everything. The skinny kid from Block H was now on television, wearing a professional jersey, living the dream that had seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. His first touch was perfect. His first pass was inch perfect. His first 90 minutes were a glimpse of greatness to come. But the most important moment came after the final whistle, when television cameras caught him looking directly into the lens and mouthing two words, "Pour vous," for you. Everyone in La Castellane knew who he was talking to. Zidane's success didn't just change his life, it changed La Castellane itself. Suddenly, every kid in the neighborhood had a football at their feet. Parents who had never cared about sports began taking their children to training sessions. The concrete courtyards that had been Zidane's classroom became pilgrimage sites. Youth coaches like Jean Verreau found themselves overwhelmed with kids wanting to train. They all wanted to be the next Zidane, he recalled with pride. But more importantly, they all believed it was possible. The transformation was visible. Crime rates dropped. School attendance improved. A neighborhood that had been synonymous with despair suddenly had something it had never possessed: hope. Even as Zidane conquered Juventus, Real Madrid, and the French national team, he never forgot La Castellane. He returned regularly, not for photo opportunities or publicity, but to remind himself where he came from. He funded youth programs, built new training facilities, and personally mentored kids from the neighborhood. But his greatest gift wasn't money, it was possibility. Every time he returned, he showed the children of La Castellane that their dreams weren't too big. Their circumstances weren't too limiting. "Look," he would tell them, pointing to the concrete towers around them. "This is where champions are made, not in fancy academies, not in perfect conditions. Right here, on this concrete, with whatever ball you can find." What made Zidane special wasn't just his skill, it was his understanding that limitation breeds creativity. The concrete courtyards of La Castellane had forced him to develop touch, vision, and intelligence that pampered academy players never needed. "Grass forgives mistakes," he would later explain to young players. "Concrete doesn't. Concrete teaches you to get it right the first time, every time." This philosophy became his signature style, never wasting a touch, never making an unnecessary pass, never taking a risk that wasn't calculated. The elegance that made him famous wasn't natural, it was learned on concrete that demanded perfection. In 2006, when Zidane announced his retirement from international football, he chose to make the announcement in La Castellane. Standing in the same courtyard where he had first fallen in love with football, surrounded by the same concrete towers that had shaped him, he spoke directly to the neighborhood kids. "This place made me who I am," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Every trophy I've won, every goal I've scored, every moment of joy, it all started here, on this concrete, with a dream that seemed impossible." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "But here's what I want you to remember. If it happened for me, it can happen for you. Not because you're from La Castellane, but because La Castellane is in you. This place doesn't limit us. It teaches us to find beauty in difficulty, to create magic from nothing." Today a statue of young Zidane stands in La Castellane's main courtyard, not the global superstar, but the 5-year-old boy with the plastic ball and impossible dreams. Children still gather around it every evening, juggling footballs, practicing their touch, chasing their own miracles. The concrete towers still stand, weathered but not broken. The unemployment is still high, the challenge is still real. But something fundamental has changed. Possibility now lives where despair once reigned. Every kid in La Castellane knows the story by heart, the story of the boy who turned concrete into a classroom, limitation into liberation, and a plastic football into a magic wand that transformed not just his own life, but the dreams of everyone around him. The miracle of La Castellane wasn't that it produced Zinedine Zidane. The miracle was that Zidane proved what La Castellane could produce when given the chance. He showed that greatness doesn't require perfect conditions, it requires perfect determination. From the concrete courtyards of France's toughest neighborhood to the pristine grass of football's greatest stages, Zidane carried one lesson. Your circumstances don't define your destiny, but they can forge your character. The plastic ball his father bought him for a few francs became the key to unlock not just his potential, but the potential of an entire generation who learned that miracles aren't things that happen to you. They're things you create for yourself, one touch at a time, on whatever ground you find beneath your feet. And sometimes, The hardest ground produces the softest touch.